Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. The title of today's webinar is Achieving Zero Trust Security Model for PeopleSoft. Our presenter today will be Greg Wendt, who will introduce himself in just a moment. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, please click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you are using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming through your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 45 minutes. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for Greg to answer at the end of this event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Greg.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. As she said, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director here at PathLock. Just a little brief history about me. I started with ERP systems back in the late 90s, so probably late 97 actually. So I started working with PeopleSoft version 5 at the time. I've upgraded and worked with all the releases all the way to the 9.2 platform before joining back. It was apps even before PathLock now, but I've been with the group about 8 years. So I've got enterprise architect experience, dotted line to CISOs, and probably have done over 400 to 500 different security reviews of different ERP systems for either customers or prospects or just independent security reviews of organizations. So that's just a brief introduction of myself. So let's jump into the content. And first I thought I would explain, who PathLock is, what we are, and what we're doing. So PathLock really is an integration that allows us to communicate with many different systems. It allows us to integrate data in and really help you assess your risks. We can automate user access reviews. We can do SOD issues. We can also monitor real-time activities inside of different systems to actually see who's violating some of your security controls that are in place, or business controls, Sarbanes-Oxley, those types of things. So we work with all of the major ERP systems with being able to provide this service for organizations. We are a market leading platform with this, especially around unified access orchestration. And we've got organizations, not really organizations, but we've got employees all over the globe. So that's one of the nice parts about the merger of all of the different groups within the PathLock organization is we now are much larger and we can service customers throughout the globe better than we could before. But you can also see some of our larger customers and partners here as well. So let's go ahead and jump into really the content at hand. So one of the ways that we wanted to start to talk about this is really the way organizations have previously managed access. It's always been kind of a manual process in communication. It would be something to where let's talk about managing onboarding a new employee, for example. So that could be anything from, okay, an email has to go over to HR. Inside of HR, they're going to hire this person. They're going to give them X job, X pay. They're going to work in X department, all of that type of information. So that's got to be created first. And then you've got from there the ripple effect. Do they need a computer? Do they not need a computer? Where are they going to sit? Is there any sort of, information that needs to go out to facilities or IT and access controls and all of those types of things. So there's a plethora of information and processes that really have to get kicked off. And a lot of those have been manual. It's, oh, we hired a new person. Here they are. They're going to work for Jim over in accounting and they need a laptop. So, now that email went out, so IT is going to order them a laptop according to what Jim tells them to order, those types of things. So there's a multitude of stakeholders and groups that are really involved with this. And then when you talk about the reviews and the auditing of this process, because it is so manual, it becomes a real challenge for the organization. And what it really does is it causes lots of issues like slow onboarding. I've talked to some organizations, for example, that could take 3 to 4 weeks for an employee to, once they're hired, and they're actually working for the organization, it could take 3 to 4 weeks before they actually, really have their computer and all of the access and the controls that they need to do their actual job. So that obviously makes them very unproductive. There's a lot of human error. Sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error. Oh, model their access like Susie, model their access like Jim. Oh, no, wait, it really needs to be a combination of those types of errors. So you end up with resources that can be really given to that person when they shouldn't have them in the first place, and controls are out of alignment. So, it's a very tedious project and time consuming thing inside of the organization. So one of the advantages to Pathlock is we really have a really unique governance access and approach focus on data security. So if you look at some of the things that we're able to do down the left-hand side comparative to IGA providers, for example. So we have fine-grained access analysis and provisioning capabilities into 140 plus business applications. And you'll see a little bit of that today when I actually demo. So you'll see provisioning and deprovisioning based upon the change of somebody within a department. So when you talk about some of the IGA providers, it's limited integration, especially when you're talking about basing those events upon a true ERP system and record of source. We also have deep transactional inspection of did do, can do analysis. The difference between did do and can do is here are the roles and permissions. This is what this user can do. Typically you can run a query out of your ERP system to be able to gather that data, but the difference is what did they do? So Jimmy and Sally did have X that they were able to do, but they did Y, 100 times, or they did X 100 times. Are they actually utilizing the access of what they currently have in the system? And many of the IGAs really lack that transactional inspection of the did do side of the users. We also integrate very directly into the system here at Pathlock. And it really gives you a centralized policy management across the access transactions and preventative controls. So you can see that the other providers really have a challenge with that. So when you talk about zero trust, first off, let's kind of define that. What is zero trust and what do we mean by that? Zero trust is really what I want to call, or I would call it, is kind of secure by default, but also least privileged. So zero trust means that regardless of you putting in your user ID and password, I'm just not going to 100% trust you unless there are other features or functions or attributes based to how you're accessing my system that show me that I can trust you. And that's sometimes what's known as like a verification, multi-factor authentication, all sorts of things like that. So, obviously when I start with zero trust, if you're within my organization on a company owned asset, on my network, hardwired into my, network, that's going to be a different level of trust than if you're wireless connected to maybe your cell phone in a coffee shop, at a conference, in the airport, on an airplane. All of those types of things, I'm not going to really trust you as much, because they're attributes based upon how you're accessing my system that really tell me, I'm not going to trust Jim as much as I normally would when Jim's sitting in the office. So he's going to only end up with least privileged access or self-service, or he's got to go through additional steps. So those contextual attributes could be anything like where your IP originated, the time of day. Maybe there's certain access that we don't want at 2 o'clock in the morning. We don't want somebody doing something after they get home from the bar. Do I trust your device? Do we need to implement multi-factor authentication? And multi-factor authentication is really one of those things that's kind of heavily involved within a zero trust environment, because you have to prove to the organization that you really are you. And you'll see if you look at some of the hacking and some of the attack vectors that are going on right now, there's a lot of vectors that are trying to figure out how to attack multi-factor authentication. So you see a lot of spoofing, or a lot of somebody, hey, send me your code. If you get a 6-digit code for multi-factor authentication, sometimes you can even get a secondary text of, hi, prove you are who you are by sending me your 6-digit code. Yeah, no, that's that's somebody who's attempting to steal my multi-factor authentication, that's attempting to log in as me. So there's a lot of spear phishing or phishing attempts around multi-factor authentication to try to get around that process. But some of the MFA methods, and really multi-factor is something that like your user ID and password, and something that you have. Typically that could be a phone, or something that you are, like biometric, a scan of your thumbprint or something like that. So something that you have is typically where they push that, or you have a number that you're going to enter in the screen. So that's how you prove who you are versus somebody else. And when we look at the different methods and ways that we apply that to the user community as they access the systems, it could be at login, it could be at a single sign-on event, something like that, to where, hey, I'm now logging into the system and we're going to challenge you right away. It could also be from an untrusted location or trusted location, or trusted browser or non-browser. And it can also be very dynamic. So maybe it's within the application. It's access certain data, certain transactions, certain fields, date of birth, bank accounts, for example. All of those are options for how you implement multi-factor authentication. It really depends upon your user community, your organization as a whole. A lot of times it'll be set as to, we're going to do multi-factor at something that is high level or very technical. So I kind of covered off on this a little bit already as to what multi-factor is with being MFA. It's something that user ID, username, password. That's not as secure as it used to be, and it's really probably the most targeted area of attacks nowadays. It used to be, when you look at historic systems, that would always be the network. Oh, we've got to get into network resources and access all this other type of stuff. Now, from a hacker's perspective, it's not necessarily the network resources that they're after. Sometimes it's just pure and simply an email address that they can spam people from. So you end up your email gets blacklisted and things like that. So it depends upon what that end user's, real target is. But a lot of times now it's the hackers are after the end user's user ID and password, because once you authenticate to many of these networks and systems, if they're utilizing single sign-on or things like that, it's also, you are that person. COVID, for example, made a lot of organizations that hadn't implemented multi-factor really think about it, because it's been something to where the phishing attacks and the targeted campaigns really followed COVID around the globe. You can look back at it historically, it was the bad actors knew, and it basically became because of the chaos, the changes that were implemented. Systems weren't, set up and designed for end users to be at home working. They were always within the network. And, now it's kind of changed the whole working model, as many organizations and many people have seen, with the number of people that still remote work versus before. So, that's why the user ID and password isn't just as secure as what it used to be. So that's why you have to prove who you are with that something you have or something you are. That's why those other pieces. And since you have to have multiple pieces, that's really why it's called multi-factor authentication. So another thing that we kind of talk about with securing your application sets is manual provisioning processes. They have always been a constraint, and it's always something that's very tedious inside of an organization. If you think about, as a whole, what's required to provision your users inside of your system, and how much effort is it to do an access review. And a user access review is typically something that could be done quarterly, it could be done 6 months, or annually. And that kind of depends upon the user group that we're working with. But if you think about your users and how many users you specifically have inside of the organization, let's talk about a 10,000 or a 5,000 employee organization. How many of those are going to be high privileged inside of systems? 10% maybe, so 500 users. But those other 4,500 users are going to have self-service. They're going to have, access to other application sets because they've got other jobs as well. And really, when we talk about provisioning users, that's what it is there's a life cycle that I'll go into in just a minute. But it really is about how do they manage, how do you manage those users through their life cycle of the access that they need within your organization? And that could be anything from onboarding to offboarding to the job changes. So there's multiple different events that are going to occur that really affect what access they have. And that's really one of the reasons why it's so important to do the user access reviews, because those users their access is going to change, as does through their life cycle working through the organization. They may come in as a clerk in the beginning, and then all of a sudden they're a manager. So let's say they were an AP clerk. Well, okay, an AP clerk's job is very different, and they have access to very different information than maybe a manager who's now doing T&E expenses and approving vacation and sick time. So they're within HR. Now they're also doing pay increases and promotions and firings and hirings and all those types of things. So obviously the access is very different. So those user access reviews become very, very important. And it really comes down to people, processes, and technology. And the technology has to do a better job of enabling the processes and the people to be effective ultimately. And that's what you've got to really achieve. So when we talk about automating that user life cycle, this is kind of that cradle to grave around the life cycle management of that user. And it starts with role design. And that's one of the reasons why the user access reviews and the role designs are so important, because you need to set up your roles in a way that's finite. They need to be very explicit as to what they grant access to. But you can also think about it, and this is an advantage of the Pathlock system, is it allows you to change how you kind of think about a role. So rather than a role specifically just being access inside of, let's say, PeopleSoft. So they're going to be an AP clerk in PeopleSoft, so they get this role. That's kind of a technical role. But what else do they need to do their job? Do they need, obviously they probably need access to Active Directory. They need email. They need maybe something in Salesforce or another system altogether. So when we talk about a role, you can actually group all of those functions together and say, oh, for an AP clerk role, this is what they need access for. Do they need access to do a VPN or a remote desktop in? So those are really permissions inside of Active Directory. Do they need certain things inside of APGL? What do they need in there? So what do they need in HR? What do they need in, because HR would now be more self-service. So in your ERP systems, it could be, well, they need self-service from an HR perspective. In financials, they need all of the information to do, or all of the authorizations to do the AP work. And then they need other extra credentials outside of those systems, at least, to be able to function and do what they need to do on the normal network. So email, PowerPoint, those types of things, for example. So, you can group those roles together to where it's really assigned as a function of that job. You can still be very technical and specific on them if you want, but we just have the ability to step up that layer and give you those controls as well. And what it does is it gives you the insight then of what does this user have holistically across the company, which then helps you with the other side of that life cycle for the SOD audits, the sample testing, and the violation management. Because sometimes it's one of those, it could be that scenario to where, oh, this user has X in financial and Y in HCM, and that's going to be able to cause them, excuse me, to allow them to be able to perform a separation of duties style attack. So that's the advantage of being able to understand the whole role of what that user needs across your organization, across all of those applications, for example, to have that insight. So that's why the role design and thinking about it holistically is so important. Then we can also get into provisioning and deprovisioning. When you're, have those roles designed like that, it becomes much easier to really automate that entire process. So if the user moves from A to B, what's going to happen now? they switch jobs. Now, oh, well, they need different permissions across the entire landscape of your organization. And what might that look like? How do we do that? So that's where we can come in with the automation to actually touch all of those different systems, which is why all of those integrations that Pathlock brings to bear is important, because we have those communications already built to where we can go in and have all those touches. So when we're talking about managing the access requests, obviously there's going to be still manual requests. When you think about the provisioning and deprovisioning, there's still going to be some sort of manual requests that have to come into play, and you've got a plan for them. Not 100% is going to be able to be automated. You can reach, near 100%, but there's still going to be, okay, special requests here, firefighter access, privileged access management, those types of things, to where maybe it's only for a short period of time that somebody needs to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Or somebody's on vacation, so now, Sally is going to cover for Jimmy, who's on vacation, and she needs to be able to do X, Y, and Z for the next week. Those types of things. So you're always going to have exceptions that you need to be able to allow for and really manage that access request efficiently and auditable. So you have the understanding, hey, this is what this occurred, and they had that access for a week, but it was taken away. Those types of things. The user access reviews really enable the efficient, we enable the efficient review process, and I'll show you that today as well, of being able to automate that flow and being able to pick and choose what systems are we included in that. So that's where that role design. So let's say, that AP clerk does have a little bit of access in HCM, they've got financials, they've got all these other things. So let's look holistically at all of that and do that user access review. Do they still need all of these different touch points within the different systems? So when it goes to the manager can see, oh, Jimmy's actually got more access in this other target system than I thought he had, and he doesn't really need that. So let's revoke that. Or, oh, Jimmy's missing access that he really does, so let's add that in. Those types of scenarios. The user access reviews is typically a very manual process, and it's going to vary depending upon the organization, how often that occurs. I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, but to come back to that a little bit, I was talking to potential customer the other day, and it was really interesting because they performed many different access reviews, but containing different populations of users. Some of their privileged access users they did monthly. So you're talking about a user access review every 30 days, basically. So there was a lot of manual work involved with that process. And then they did non-privileged users every 6 months. So you had different scope involved as to who, what access was being, what users and what access was being looked at, but then, also different ones to track. Having to do that monthly, that was a lot. So that can be a very tedious and time consuming process. And we can really enable that through a full automation. Also, I kind of like talking about 5, 6, and 7, the SOD audit, sample testing, and violation management kind of together, because they all kind of go together. SOD audits typically, if you think about how an organization is going to do that, they're going to take a small sample testing. It might be 2, 3, 5%, maybe 10%. I would doubt they go that high, but there's going to be a percentage of the transactions that they're going to look at and sample test that. If all of those transactions are valid, then great, then we don't have any violations. But the problem is it is just a sample. They can't, they historically don't look at all transactions. It's just a very small subset. So, how do you know that you're actually not having any SOD style violations when you're not auditing really the entire scope of what's happening inside of your system? So that's where that complete and continuous coverage really comes into effect, because, we've got to improve the audit effectiveness. It can't just be such a small, small subset of what the challenge is. And then violation management, what are you going to do? How are you going to clean it up? And quantifying that from a risk perspective. Is it, maybe there's 10,000 SOD violations of this one small thing, but from a financial or from a real risk perspective, it's $100, or, from a financial perspective, or almost zero risk to the organization as a whole. Well, do I really care? Probably not as much as I care about something that, has a real financial allocation of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year. That I'm going to be concerned about. So it allows you to quantify that real risk and really target the areas that are important. So I am going to switch over here real quick and actually get into a demo. So I'm going to bring open a couple new windows here, and we're going to go about doing this. So let's do a new tab here. So we can look at going through a couple of different examples. So what I've got now is I'm going to log into, and I'm going to start with some of the specific information around some of the controls put into place. So this is going to be more around single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, some of those particular challenges. So I'm going to start with single sign-on because when you're talking about accessing an ERP level system, it's much easier when you do it through single sign-on. So I'm going to sign in as Vicky Zinn, standard low self-service privileged user. And what happens here is I logged into Office. So I created a session with Office. So now I've got that with ADFS or Azure, for example. So I've authenticated to one of those systems. So now as I launch into the PeopleSoft system, what's going to occur is I'm actually going to communicate back to that identity provider, Azure, ADFS, Ping, Okta, whichever one that it may be, and see, oh, I already got a session established with that. So I can trust that this user has access into the system because they've already authenticated. So this is who I am. So now you can see that I'm actually within PeopleSoft is Vicky Zinn, and I've got access to her self-service information. That's what I launched, was additional information. Some of the data now is masked. So those are some of the additional controls that we have of I'm going to protect data that's within the system based upon, I don't need to come to HR to see my social security number. I should know that. I should have my own social security, little card, for example, my date of birth. I know my date of birth. Maybe it's one of those things I don't want that data, viewable, or maybe I can view it when I'm at my desk, but not when I'm remote on the internet, for example. So I'm going to go back home. One of the advantages is point in time multi-factor authentication. And that's kind of what we were talking about with, we're going to do a business process and now we're going to inject that challenge in. So before, to authenticate into the system, okay, you're not doing any, we don't know that you're going to do anything high privileged or important. So we're going to trust the identity provider that authentication counts. But now if you want to update financial information like your bank account number, for example, now you have to go through that multi-factor authentication. So this is really where it's that difference between stepping up that authentication. So this is that I knew who I was, or I have what I am, but now I need to have that extra step. So I'm going to do a push notification with my device here real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and approve that. And once I do, I have access to the account number and I can make those changes. That's really that point in time authorization to be able to say, all right, at a zero trust at first, I was able to see some basic information, but if I really wanted to change, work with, switch to another user as a privileged user or something like that, then I would have to go through that multi-factor authentication. So that check came just in time for me to actually be able to work with my financial information. But if I was viewing some of the other pages, maybe I don't have to go through MFA. That's the way of being able to do it, very contextual and targeted as people are accessing the system. Going to pull open another window here real quick. One of the things that's kind of nice about this as well is the application of that MFA. So I'm going to sign in directly rather than utilizing single sign-on. And I'm going to see in this scenario where, because I'm creating a direct connection to PeopleSoft, I utilized a two-tier user ID and password. We've got a challenge here for multi-factor because that's the highest privileged account inside of PeopleSoft. So I did that push notification, I can approve that, and I can move on. So, that's options as well. Much like we talked about from the presentation, you have choices. Do you want to do it at login? Do you want to do it at a certain event? protect certain data inside of the transactions. You've got all of those different options of how you can implement really a zero security or zero trust security model inside of your PeopleSoft system. So it's very targeted. You can pick and choose and implement that. You know, the nice part about it too is the way that works with your end users is the targeted MFAs typically have a better adoption rate rather than just the, oh, I've got to do MFA at the sign on. Because the closer you can keep the request to the secure transaction that you're tying it to, the happier the end user is going to be, because they're also going to understand it better. They're going to see, oh, I'm working with financial information. I get having to go through MFA. I want to go through MFA. You know, some of our customers, for example, have implemented it that way. And they'll normally end up having end users call and say, oh, I like that protection. Now put it on my W-2s, put it on this page over here. And if you have end users asking for additional MFA, you're kind of winning that whole battle of you know, how to really affect multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out here. I'm going to come back. I'm actually going to authenticate in as a different user because I need to do some additional or different access. So let's talk briefly. I'm going to kind of switch gears here for a second. We're going to talk about some of the user access reviews. So I'm going to look at our system, and this is our PathLock system, and some of the things that we're able to do here. This is really about the lifecycle management of the user ID and their lifecycle inside of your organization, that joiner, mover, leaver process. So there's a couple of different things that I wanted to touch base on. So when we talk about provisioning of access or cross-system access, these two are both very, very similar. I'm just going to kind of walk through it. But one of the things that I wanted to show was this is really about multiple systems. So if I just go through, I'm going to hit next here, and I'm going to hit next because I really wanted to show you this. So we can actually add in multiple controls for multiple different systems, which is one of the reasons why this is a new employee per system. So you can set up controls or authorizations inside of Active Directory, inside of PeopleSoft, inside of Salesforce, inside of SAP. This is really where you're grouping those roles together to say, oh, this user really needs access to these three systems with these security inside of each system to be able to do the job function that I just hired them to do. Here's a new employee request that's coming in, off we go. So the nice part about it is all of these are going to be from that perspective. If we can actually review the progress, so we can see how many of these have been done, where they all sit. So that allows you to really, keep that in mind. So there's a whole audit flow, a tracking of this, that's going on behind the scenes. So that's really, let's talk about those one-offs. That's that one-off of I need to pull this in. I need to grant these authorizations to this user in multiple different systems. If I go back up, maybe it's just access inside of PeopleSoft. So, we can come in and we can either do an access request. We can also do a role advisor, but they want to change her up the access. So, as a new user comes in, we can just go through here. We can see now this is specifically inside of PeopleSoft. So as I look at this, what roles or what am I coming in? I'll just see if there's one in here real quick. Let's see if I've got one. Maybe not. So I can grab the roles, assign them to the user, and then they're going to be automated, and we can have that process click in. So that's something that we can do specifically for one application set, or we can do that cross application where you're looking at a couple of different. So let's actually talk a little bit more about what happens next. So as that request comes in, how can we automate that? What can we do with that particular process? So I'm going to actually go through a workflow. So I'm going to close out of this window. I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to go back to PeopleSoft. And what I want to do is in PeopleSoft, I'm going to go to a current job, and I'm going to go look at a certain employee. So I am put in too many twos. So I'm going to look at Nicole's work record. And what we're going to do here is we're going to change her job. So she's now going to end up in a completely different department. And what's going to happen is, based upon the department change, things are going to change within her security inside of Active Directory, inside of PeopleSoft, all going to happen with a workflow. And I'll go into more details on that. So let's go ahead and kind of start that process. I'm going to go ahead and hit plus here to add a new row, and I'm going to change her department. So I'm going to put her in 9410. So she's going to work in the research department. So once I tab out of there, we're going to see, all the data gets validated, because this is a normal process flow. You're paying somebody, an HR clerk, to go in and do this job. So they're going to keep track of everybody's, jobs inside of the HCM system and payroll, so they get the correct, pay inside of their organization. So we have now successfully saved this and created that event. So let's look to see, before we make any other changes, let's go look real quick at her security. So I'm going to open up her user profile here real quick. And with that, I'm going to open up PTD here, and here's her user profile. So we can see her ID ties back to the particular employee ID, and also the roles that she has. So currently, with the role that she did have, because I haven't done anything yet, so she had the AG Composer user. So this is her security that she had inside of the PeopleSoft system. So now let's actually go and kick off a process. So I'm going to manually do this. We would, you can have this scheduled to where, it's running a couple of times a day. It depends upon how quickly you want all of these different things to get caught and by our process flow and injected into the workflow. So what's happening now is, what we're doing is, we're going out and we're looking at that department structure and comparing the current departments versus what somebody has now versus what they had before. Is really, in essence, what's happening. So it's going to take a minute or two to go through this process, but that's why I said you could have this scheduled a couple of times a day. And the important part is, once this occurs, a workflow is going to get kicked off. And the workflows can be very customizable. So you can actually have multiple steps within the workflows. So for example, the workflow that I'm going to be working with, there's an approval of. You could have it also to where there's no approval and it's just completely automated. So this one does have an approval, because from an example perspective, just wanted to be able to show that. So we're going to have to go through, once this is done and the workflow is created, and somebody's going to have to go in and say, yes, Nicole should actually get this new access. Once that comes in, maybe they needed to ask additional questions before they approve that, and they submit those. The nice part about it is the approval comes into the users that it needs to come into. So this is going to take just a minute or two. So, and then once that approval of the workflow takes place, then we can automate all the provisioning and deprovisioning within the multiple systems following that up. So that's really what you're going to see here in just a second as this process finishes. I'm going to refresh that real quick. So I'm going to go over, and if I look at the workflows here real quick, you can see some of them. I'm going to refresh this page real quick. You can see some of them have been done in the past, and then also the new one that just came in. So we can see that I've got a new one here. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this transaction. And what we'll see here is, this is the username. That's why I just opened up in PeopleSoft. I can actually still flip over there and show you that. So the changing of the roles. So here's her name, what her position title is, what she's doing, the new role mapping. So what this did was, the new department code that she's now got, we need to add certain domain level access. We need to take away level, access inside of Active Directory, and we also need to change her role description as to what she has inside of PeopleSoft. Here, kind of like what I said before, we have the option of, do I need to submit a question? Do I need to ask somebody about this? Should this be taking place? Any of those types of things. But then I also have quickly up here in the upper right an approve or decline. I'm going to go ahead and approve that, and I'll just say approved, if I could spell real quick, by GW. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And immediately once that's done, it's going to set off the next step in the workflow. So now what's happening is the workflow is automatically going out and performing those steps. So any cross system access that needs to be granted is actually going to be taking place at this particular time. So it's going to go in and it's going to it's already finished at this point. So I'm going to go back to the search workflow requests. I'm going to just refresh this real quick. We're going to see that the one I was just looking at has got the check. So it's actually done and it says finished. So I'm going to look into that for a little bit more detail just to kind of show you what occurred. So what we've got is we're going to remove the roles. So we've got removal of roles from Active Directory, PeopleSoft, and we're going to apply roles in the new role mapping that they're getting. We can see that the action is an add. So all of this is, documented. We've got audit flows. And then from the workflow request down at the bottom, we went through, we started it, we did the approval. I walked through that. We removed all of those, added the new provisioning, and then we finished up. And now we're at the point we are now. So what occurred inside of PeopleSoft? So I'm going to go back over and do a quick return to search. I'm going to open up that user, and now the user has a completely different role inside of PeopleSoft. I didn't touch PeopleSoft. I didn't touch Active Directory. It was all based upon that automation of that workflow, touching all of the security access that they needed to have. So very streamlined, very efficient, and that's what that automation can give you. It can really give you those controls put in place to be able to, provision and deprovision correctly. I'm going to go back over to the portal system here real quick. I'm going to talk real briefly about the access reviews as well, because the access reviews, and that's the user access reviews. So user access reviews have a couple of different pieces and functions. So one, you've got to define the process. What's going to be the scope? And I'm going to go ahead and pull that open. So when we're talking about the scope, what is your population? And what we do is we call this a campaign. So that scope is going to be selecting a group of users. Maybe it's high privileged, maybe it's only certain users. We have all different activity groups, user groups. You can split and choose multiple different ways that you actually define that population. You can also define the elements for the review that you want to look at to include in there. Also, the really cool part about this is you can select the systems for review. So this goes back to kind of that terminology of what I was talking about earlier with the reviews of being able to do multiple systems. So we have Active Directory, Salesforce, PeopleSoft. You can select and choose which ones you want there. So it allows you to really see multiple different systems and what access these users have. Do you need to, customize any text on the emails that are going to keep coming into the end targets of the workflows? And then you can save it, activate it, and how often you're going to run this. Is this a one-time, or are we going to do it monthly, every 6 months, those types of things? So that's what you do to start that campaign. But I'm going to switch over to the manager view, because what does it look like when I have things that are in my list to do? So I've logged in, and I'm going to look at the PS role review process. So what do I have out there? So we can see now, oh, I've got to actually review all of these different people, who's got access to what. So maybe I go into AA Adams here and I can hit the detail on Adams. All right, well, here's the authorizations, and this is what they've actually got inside of the system. So I can look through each one of these. Okay, which ones do they need? Do they need additional access? Do we need to add, reject, all of those types of things? So the nice part is I can either approve, all of them. I can reject, and the nice part is on the reject, if we take away that authorization, it's going to then, remove that authorization for this user. The automation comes in, so it's going to be gone. You don't have to follow up and, have somebody go out and do that process. There can be complete automation around that control then put in place and all the audits and flows. So another thing that we can do is we can actually track and give you an idea of the usage percentage of how often they're actually using that particular function. So not only do they have, yes, they can do this function, but you can also see they did do what's inside of this function as well, or the authorization. So it does narrow that down and let you know that they actually did do that. So the nice part is you can go through that process. It's all going to be automated, the whole review right there, and it's going to be able to go through your workflows, whatever you need to do, whether it's monthly, 6 months, all of those types of things. So you can completely automate that process flow to make it very easy inside of there. So with the access reviews, we can also look at different statuses to understand where the review itself might sit. So if I were to go back and grab the PS review, let's look at that real quick. We can see where, some of these are where they're at within the step. So it's approval by direct manager. So a lot of them are going to be sitting within that particular group, how many activities are in that role. So we can see where they're at. Can also go back and see the holistic progress review of the entire. So if I look at the role process here, how many authorizations do we totally have? How many are waiting on review? How many have been done? How many have been marked for removal? Those types of things. So we can get an overview dashboard of, kind of top down, what we're looking at, who's all done, those types of things. So the nice part about it is it's tracked all the way through. You're able to look at it through multiple different dashboards. All of the workflows go out directly to the end user who's really assigning and should be approving this information, and it's going to be tracked as we go through that. So that's the real nice part about the user access review is we can definitely make that process much easier for you. We can automate the changes, much like what you saw with the departmental change of being able to go in and make those changes automatically for you. That helps you with your life cycle management of all of your different systems, because through that automation, it can be far more consistent. It can be repeatable, but it's also going to be something that as you go through, it's going to continue to get better and better and better, because through that automation, it's going to allow you to be more efficient in your reviews, and your reviews are going to be done better, because it's an easier process to do. It's not, okay, here's your spreadsheet with 10,000 lines on it and go through and update your 250 lines for your 10 different employees type of thing. It's something that's going to be very direct, workflow, easy, automated, tracked, those types of things. So let's go ahead and move quickly back to the PowerPoint. So let me bring that back up here real quick. So, a couple of different things. So when we're talking about, recommendations for implementing zero trust security model, it's really got to start with some sort of implementation of multi-factor authentication. You have to be able to inject another step of that authentication to have that user prove who they are. The other side of it is you really need to have least privileged security access put in place. So yes, maybe they can access the system, but they're only going to be able to get to these very small, least privileged transactions or authorizations that don't expose any information. You make sure those particular authorizations don't show any PII, so you don't have to worry about any sort of identity theft of that particular user. And if any of those types of data fields need to be accessed, that's where that multi-factor comes into play. Because at that particular point, hey, let's, if somebody's accessing a social security number, national ID, let's make sure that they are who they are. Make them go through that multi-factor authentication before they see that data, because we don't want any of that data exposed to bad actors, hackers, any of those types of things, especially with all the different privacy and compliance laws that are coming into effect. Really tying down and making it where that data is very restricted is always a really good idea anyway. And it's really an understanding that just because you connect to the VPN doesn't really make you secure either. As I said before, I've done hundreds of security reviews, and it's interesting with a lot of organizations just think, well, I connected to the VPN, I'm done. No, the VPN is just another connection to your network. You have to really think through the entire process of what's allowed on your VPN, how is the authentication on your VPN occurring, is there any multi-factor in there as well, what's the trust, all of those types of things. And VPNs, especially during COVID, kind of caught a little bit of a bad rap because many organizations weren't sized and scoped to have enough VPNs VPN servers or connections to actually work with as many employees that were now all of a sudden at home. So the VPNs can sometimes cause you additional problems and challenges through all of that. And sometimes, especially if it's a secure VPN, it can make it very difficult to understand what a particular process or user is actually doing because of the tunneling and encryption of the VPN as well. So another area, when we talk about strengthening the access governance with automation, we kind of went through a lot of that. So it allows you to automate access to users through their life cycle, whether that's joining the organization, moving, changing roles, or leaving the organization. If you think about leaving the organization itself, there's a big enough question there. What are you going to do with access to an employee that's been there? Do they need access to W-2s? Do they need payroll information, tax information? How are you going to allow that? What are you going to do with their security? How are their roles going to work? How are you going to manage that? Are they in your identity provider? Or are you just cutting off all access to begin with? So lots of questions come into play there, and lots of different rules come into play. So it's not just typically a simple thing of, hey, they're left, turn them off. Might not be the option that you have as an organization, depending upon all of the other business drivers that are in play there. So you can definitely unlock process efficiency with automated provisioning and the lifecycle management. As you can see today, if that process is scheduled, the workflows kick in, somebody can log in, look at the approvals that they need to do. There's others that wouldn't need approvals at all, especially when you're talking about maybe onboarding and giving simple access to a user, self-service over here, certain email access, those types of things. Those roles can be granted very easily. They can be protected, set up through those role review processes, so they're clean, they're good. So I can automate the provisioning of those roles very easily through the long term. So, and if you think about it, depending upon your organization, maybe a retail organization around hiring and firing with Christmas and the holiday rush and those types of things. I've talked to some where it's like we hire 10,000 people in 3 months and then we let them go in January. That's a lot of process to do. You've got to hire all those people. You've got to provision all of those people. You've got to make sure all of the security is done. And then, maybe 3 to 2, depending upon when they were hired, a very short time period later, they know they're all going to be let go. So then you have to turn off all of that access. And then what are you going to do from a W-2 perspective? Are you still allowing them certain access? So, talking to them, this was a very challenging problem for them, and it took up a lot of resources. Doing a very simplistic job, if you really want to think about it from that perspective. That is something that can be automated and really make them more efficient through that lifecycle management of the provisioning and deprovisioning of their accounts inside of the system. Streamlining emergency access and reporting. Emergency access is always one of those things that can be a challenge. We're going to grant user A, Jimmy access for the next 3 hours, 4 hours, or 2 days to be able to do stepped up permissions that he normally wouldn't be able to do. Maybe he's got to act as a system administrator and perform and updates into the system, something like that. So you need to be able to grant that access and then make sure that you remove it so that he doesn't have it on his normal day-to-day style access. So, and then you can automate the risk analysis in 90% of those access requests, because if you can really take care of, especially self-service, low-level access like that, if you can automate those, then it allows you to focus on the ones that are really your one-offs and your high privileged users. Focus on, if we go back to that example that I was talking about of 5,000 or 10,000 users, if we have 5,000 and 10% are high privileged, it allows you to focus on those 500 users rather than the 4,500 users in the organization. Focus on the ones that actually have the keys to the kingdom and can do more functions inside of your system and put more scrutiny on them than the other 4,500 that really have basic access inside of the system to begin with. And then you can perform the access reviews in hours, not weeks. As you can see, that process is very automated, would come to the user. They can hit the check boxes. Yes, I approve all of these. Yes, I approve, or no, deny, remove that. So you can see that process is very automated, comes directly to them. We can, automate the entire process behind of removing any rejected roles, so there isn't any delay on removing that style of access from the system as well. So really allows you to do that much more efficiently and document an auditable process as well. So with that, I'm going to open it up to see if there's any questions. If we don't have any questions, which we may or may not today, just a reminder, if you do have a question, just submit it with your GoToWebinar control panel in the questions pane. We can make sure those get answered. If you think about a question later, you can always email us at info@pathlock.com, and we can follow up with a question there as well. But Stephanie, I'll let you talk about some announcements while we hold the question window open for a bit.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so we have a few announcements. We have an upcoming event happening next week, ISACA GRC, and that's in Orlando, Florida from August 22nd to the 24th. And then we also have some upcoming webinars. Next week, we have a webinar called How to Assess Security Weaknesses and Risks Across Your SAP Application Ecosystem. And that will be on Thursday, August 25th at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And then our next PeopleSoft presentation or webinar will be quickly detect and respond to PeopleSoft security threats, and that will be on Thursday, September 8th. If you want to mark your calendar for that, and that will be at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And with that, we just wanted to say thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Greg, for the presentation. And if you want to reach out to us, you can reach us at info@pathlock.com. And with that, we hope to see you at future webinars.